Welcome to tonight's video on part 3 notes. We're going to talk about some more derivative rules. The first rule is the product rule when you multiply two functions together, and that is equal to f of x times g prime of x plus g of x times f prime of x. And in other words, it says that the product of functions is equal to the first function times the derivative of the second plus second function times derivative of the first. That's what it's saying. And so that's what it says down below here. And it also says, by extension, if you had three functions, how you would treat that. So using the product rule here, notice we have two functions, x squared times sine of x. All right, so notice the first function is x squared, and that means the derivative is 2x. The second function is sine of x, and that means the derivative is cosine of x. Okay, so if we do the product rule, excuse me, the product rule, and we say that y prime is equal to the first function, which is x squared, times the derivative of the second, cosine x, plus sine x times 2x. So basically, when you simplify, the derivative is equal to x squared cosine x plus 2x sine x. That is the derivative. All right, for this next one, notice you could multiply this out, but just to do the product rule, I'm going to do two separate functions. So f of x is equal to t minus 1, f prime is 1, g of x is equal to, we'll call, actually they're t's, so I'll put the t's in there instead of the x's, is t to the third plus 2t squared minus 5t plus 7. And then the derivative is 3t squared plus 4t minus 5. So by the product rule, s prime of t is equal to the first function, t minus 1, times the derivative of the second, plus the second function, which is t to the third plus 2t squared minus 5t plus 7 times the derivative of the first, which is 1. So when you FOIL here, the t minus 1, you get 3t to the third and all this stuff here. And remember, it's plus t to the third plus 2t squared minus 5t plus 7, because that's times 1. So when you combine like terms, you get 4t to the third plus 3t squared minus 14t plus 12. And that is s prime of t. All right. All right, so I wrote out the proof already, and if you're talking about the proof of the product rule, f prime of x times g of x, or sorry, f of x times g of x. So by the definition of derivative, this is what you would have. And then in order to do this proof, you have to add and subtract the same thing to the denominator. And you're allowed to do that as long as you cancel it, balance it out. And so you're going to add and subtract f of x plus delta x times g of x to the middle here, because by doing that, notice these first two terms, you can factor out an f of x plus delta x. And in the second two terms, you can factor out a g of x. And then if you take the limit of each one individually, that gives you f of x times the derivative of g plus g of x times the derivative of f. So that is the proof of the product rule. Now the quotient rule says that if you take g of x times f prime of x minus f of x times g prime of x all over g of x squared, that is the quotient rule. In other words, it says the derivative of a quotient of functions is equal to g of x times f prime of x minus f of x times g prime of x all over the square of g of x. So how does this work? Well, if you look at x squared over sine x, there are two functions there that you're taking the quotient of. So the first function, f of x, is equal to x squared. So that means f prime is 2x. The second function, g of x, is equal to the sine of x. And g prime of x is equal to cosine x. So now if you look, you're going to take g, which is sine of x, times f prime minus f, which is x squared, times cosine x, all over, so this is y prime, all over the square of g, which is sine x squared. So if I just simplify that, I get 2x sine x minus x squared cosine x all over sine squared. And that is my final answer. All right, let's look at B again. So the first function, f of x, is t minus 1. The derivative is 1. The second function is t to the third plus 2t squared minus 5t plus 7. The second function is, or the derivative is 3t squared plus 4t minus 5. And so remember, by multiplying, so if you put it in the quotient rule, so it's g f prime minus f g prime all over g squared. So then when you multiply, so you get t to the third plus 2t squared minus 5t plus 7 minus, and then you FOIL here. So when you FOIL, you get 3t to the third plus t squared minus 9t plus 5 all over this quantity squared. And then after you distribute the negative sign and combine like terms, you get that s prime of t is equal to negative 2t to the third plus t squared plus 4t plus 2 all over t to the third plus 2t squared minus 5t plus 7 squared. And that is the derivative. All right, try the last one on your own, and then I'll go through the answer. All right, so here the first function, x cosine x, is actually a product, so you have to do the product rule to find the derivative of f prime of x. And then g of x, is x squared plus 1, so the derivative is 2x. So then you apply the quotient rule. So g f prime minus f g prime. So then when you FOIL, you get negative x, all this stuff here. And then you have to combine like terms, because notice you have a minus 2x squared cosine x and a plus x squared cosine x. So that's where you get this. And then that is your derivative. Yes, cool stuff. So to prove the quotient rule, we're going to do the definition of derivative. So there we go for the first step. Now remember, we'd multiply to get rid of the denominators. So notice that's what happens when you multiply to get rid of the denominators in the numerator. And then just like we did last time, we're going to add and subtract the same thing to the denominator. All right. So the same thing that we're going to add and subtract here is f of x, g of x, because that's going to allow us to split it up into two limits. All right, so finishing up by adding and subtracting f of x times g of x to both sides, we're able to factor out a g of x from the first two terms, and then we're able to factor out an f of x from the second two terms, and then we'll take the limit of everything separately, and that's where you get g times f prime minus f times g prime all over g of x squared. All right, so that concludes the first video for the part 3 notes. The second video about the trig functions will be coming up shortly.